right, so we've defined science. Before we get into the next thing we're talking about, let's go ahead and define biology real quick. It is the study of living things. Let's break that word down. Bio means life. OG means study of. So anytime you see ology or logy, that's usually the study of, or the study of. So ecology, study of ecosystems, right? Zoology, study of animals. Biology, study of life. So it's an incredibly large field of science. Biology is like the umbrella field, right? It encompasses a lot of smaller fields of science, including botany, microbiology, zoology, anatomy, ecology, genetics, molecular biology. I teach human anatomy and physiology as well. That falls under the biology umbrella, but we don't call it biology course, right? Because it's specifically about human anatomy and physiology. So in this course, we learn a little bit. We sort of take a sampling of each of these. We learn about ecology, genetics, a little bit of molecular bio and zoology, botany, right? So we take little bits of this, right, so that you can help create a foundation in science. Whether you pursue science or not, it's still important to understand the basics of science. But what are living things? And where do they come from? What are the characteristics of living things? So that's really what we're going to dive into next. So let's first talk about spontaneous generation. So until the middle of the 17th century, folks believed that life just arose from non-living things. It just spontaneously appeared. Obviously, we knew that people and animals gave birth, but there were other unexplained phenomena like maggots just appearing on meat and mice just appearing in brain. So they thought that they just spontaneously generated. And it seems absurd, but remember, science wasn't anything like it is today, right? Creationism, not realism, was the prevailing theory of just all happenings in life, right? Meaning religion, right? Everyone just believed in God. God created this, God created that. The Bible was everything. In Christianity or and then all the other religions, right? Religion basically was the prevailing explanation for most things. And so this guy, Francesco Redi, an Italian doctor, proposed a new theory. He suggested that flies on rotting meat human eggs that were just too small to see until they hatched into maggots. So they didn't arise from the non-living meat, right? So a piece of steak is not living, it's dead. So we ran a controlled experiment to test this hypothesis. What we did is we had a couple of jars here. Just look at the top row here. One of them you left open, one covered with gauze, which is porous, of course, it lets the air through, and then the other was sealed completely, right? So the one that was open attracted flies in the jar. The one that was covered in gauze attracted flies at the top of the jar. They obviously couldn't get in. And then the one that was sealed did not attract flies because the scent was not coming out, right? So he was able to conclude from this experiment that maggots only came from contact with flies because maggots did appear on the top of the gauze where the flies were in contact with. So they did not spontaneously arise from the air. So that led to a new theory called biogenesis. Bio means, again, living. Genesis means to create. All right, so create from the living is called biogenesis. Believe it or not, people resisted this explanation. They did not believe Redi and created experiments to try to disprove Redi's results. And that might sound obnoxious or arrogant or whatever the case is. But curiosity, while curiosity is an important part of science, so is skepticism, right? And I'm not talking about like conspiracy theories. Like I'm skeptical of, the theory of evolution, so I just am going to say it doesn't exist, right? If you're skeptical, you got to go out and try to disprove, right, the science, right? Try to debunk it, right, through the scientific process, right? You don't just decide that it's not true and everyone's wrong and your hypothesis is right without testing it, right? You need to be able to test your hypothesis. You need to go out and disprove others. So other scientists trying to disprove Redi's results is just good science, right? This guy came out with a novel it's good science for these other folks to either try to replicate his study or disprove it. So Louis Pasteur was a microbiologist, and he designed an experiment and with the intention of validating these results. Okay, so he sterilized broth in a swan neck flask, which trapped microorganisms before reaching the broth. Right, so microorganisms that might cause mold, right, aren't easily able to access the broth here. And so what happened was when the neck was broken off of one of the flasks, the microorganisms were able to grow in the broth. But when this kind of the neck here remained intact, the microorganisms couldn't get to the broth, and no mold actually grew. So what you're looking at here is sort of just a little bit of a depiction. So first, obviously, they had to boil the broth. And so both the control and the experimental group were boiled, right, to kill off any microorganisms within the broth. And then they were left to sit out, and some microorganisms were able to get into the flask that did not have the swan neck here. And I think this very experiment was attempted prior to this, but the microorganisms grew inside of both of them. But the problem was, I think it was later found out that they weren't boiled for long enough was the problem to kill off all the microorganisms within the broth. So that's a good example of you want to go ahead and replicate other people's studies, right? Try to do the same thing. And if there's flaws in their methods, like they didn't boil something long enough to kill off microorganisms, right? Replicating that study and doing it the right way is a good way to kind of point out those flaws, right? So how are scientific, this is extremely important, right? How scientific theory is different from scientific law. So a theory is a hypothesis that has been tested with a significant amount of data. Like a theory is legit, okay? That is, it's as close to being true as is literally possible in science, okay? Now, a scientific law, on the other hand, describes a pattern in nature. It generally doesn't include an explanation of why. So it's Newton's laws, right? Just describes an object in motion will stay in motion. It doesn't explain why. Oftentimes it's like a mathematical formula, right? It's just objective, right? You plug in these numbers and this is what happens, right? But theory is just a huge collection of data, right? So the germ theory, theory of evolution, right? Theory of relativity, right? These things are all accepted and well understood, right? Some components of them change over time as we gather new information, but generally the theory itself remains intact. So the thing, and there's one of Newton's laws of reaction has an equal and opposite reaction. So Redi and Pasteur's experiments I just described provided data to reject the prevailing theory of their day. Okay. Now let me point out, right, like when you and I say, oh, I have a theory, right? In everyday conversation, theory simply means a hunch, right? If Johnny is coming to class late every single day, right, I might float the theory that Johnny isn't getting enough sleep at night, right? He comes in, he's looking tired, he's all disheveled, his hair's a mess, his tie, his collar's up. That is just a theory. I've done nothing to test it. In the context of that theory, it's simply a hunch, right? It's not anything legit, right? But when we talk about a theory in science, that is solid, right? It is well studied, it is well accepted. So although many scientists believed in spontaneous generation, two scientists named Redi and Pasteur disproved this theory. They showed that living things come from other living things, and this theory is called biogenesis, or the creation of life.